Welcome to the Philosophemes channel. This is Season 1, Episode 3, in which we discuss the basic concept of ontology. All right. So the topic of ontology is one of those topics that we could talk about forever. I absolutely love this topic. I write about this all the time. I think about this all the time. But we'll go ahead and address it in terms of an episode and a basic concept, just so that we have something that we can always refer back to whenever we encounter this in the seminars, for example, and we want to just brush up on it. Okay. In terms of the overview, it's going to be the same as the first two episodes, the first one on soteriology and the second one on criteriology. So this is number 3 on ontology. Here again, we have the overview of philosophy, or we could say the architectonic of philosophy in general. We already spoke about how philosophy in particular refers to the history of philosophy, and I will dedicate an episode to that, and we will talk about it in seminars going forward as well. But for now, we're trying to complete the idea of what is the structure of philosophy in general. And what we see then is that when we are philosophizing, we could be talking about we could be giving an account of how to save ourselves. We could be giving an account of how to get from a better state of being or from one state of being to a better state of being. We could then be, for example, articulating the criteria for understanding a state of being and for understanding how to move to another state of being. And then here, when we're doing ontology, what we're doing is we're trying to understand what we mean by being, right? What does it mean to be? Clearly, then, you could see that the interrogatives associated with ontology would be what is being, who am I, and also we're going to see that ontology is intimately related to theories of time. So, of course, we won't be able to address all of this in this episode, but this is why the interrogatives what, who, and when are associated with ontology. Okay, this is one of these ideas that when I start to think about it, having taught so many university level courses, when I start to think about this, I become flooded with all of this information, and I actually find myself spending more energy trying to hold back all the ideas. But ultimately what I want to say here is just that if you're going to learn philosophy, if you're going to understand philosophy, this is such an important idea. I cannot do this idea justice in terms of stating its importance in just a couple phrases. I mean, it's just wildly powerful and wildly important for us. So what we want to do is we just want to steadily and slowly move into this, right? So when we are talking about anything that is, we can situate these beings in terms of 3 different categories. And these 3 categories would refer to the 3 branches of philosophy known as philosophical theology, philosophical cosmology, and philosophical psychology. Just knowing that, to my mind, is very, very important. The work that will do for you. Again, we're at such a high level of zoom. We're at such a high level of abstraction right now that when you start to be able to think to yourself, so when somebody says, well, I think, whatever, if you're able to immediately recognize, okay, we're doing philosophical theology. Okay, we're doing philosophical cosmology. If you're able to immediately categorize a thought in terms of one of these branches, this becomes so helpful for you. I mean, it even makes just the energy expenditure of thought more efficient. And I understand that efficiency is not necessarily always the best thing, but here it's just very helpful because things can get confusing very quickly when we start talking about what is. So again, philosophical theology, cosmology, and psychology. I've got a nice graphic that I built for us that we'll see here in a moment. So in terms of the etymology of ontology, again, we have the Greek words. Here we have onta and logos. And so onta refers to that which is, existing things. Notice here the time reference. We've got the present, and also onta referring to the truth. Now, this can be compared and contrasted with ousia. Ousia is a term that we will see in Aristotle. Coming from Aristotle, ousia is really the Greek term that is responsible for what is referred to as substance ontology in early modern philosophy. So we'll get to all of that, but basically the idea is that depending upon how you understand being, of course, that's going to influence the way that you talk about everything that is beyond that, right? Or just everything that is, period. So we want to recognize at this point that there is a distinction between that which is and that which has properties. There is a distinction. This is something that many people will just ignore, but it'll be helpful for us to recognize this. Okay, so then when we see logos, to give an account of being, so again, this is the idea of to give an account of that which is, right? Or to give an account of truth. Maybe a better way to say this is to give an account of the truth thing process, to give an account of presence. What is present and what is the present? What is presence itself? So we'll come to see the value of this as we go a little bit further. Okay, let's just leave it there for now. Okay, here it is. So notice that I took the famous flood imagery and I cleaned it up and added the categories from Transcendental philosophy to it. So what we have here then is philosophical cosmology, philosophical theology, and philosophical psychology. I think it's important also that they're placed where they are in regard to this illustration. Sensibility, imagination, understanding, and reason. We can and we will discuss how these aspects of experience relate to philosophy, but we can't do that right now. So the idea here is that when we are talking about beings, we are able to organize and identify what type of being we are talking about by recognizing that it's going to be one of these three kinds of being. So even if we are talking about, for example, just an idea, we could say, what is an idea? You could say, well, an idea has a kind of being that is different, for example, than the being of a tree. So whereas the being of a tree belongs in philosophical cosmology, the being of an idea belongs in philosophical psychology. So there's so much, I'm having such a difficult time holding back. So there's so much to be said about this, but let's just say for now, this is what we're looking at. This is a nice memory aid. So then notice then I think it's important to make a distinction here and understand the distinction between ontology and empiricism. Ontology studies the being, and notice that there's a hyphen here in the word being. So ontology studies the being of beings, in other words, that which is, and empiricism studies the manner in which beings are experienced. Okay, so when we say something like, I guess we're talking about trees today. So if we say something about, what is a tree, we are asking a question about a certain kind of being. What is the kind of being that is the being that the tree is? But when we ask about the being of this being that is a tree, right, we are asking about something that is more universal than this particular tree or this particular being. So we have this particular being, for example, the tree, and then we can ask the question about the being of that tree that is the kind of being, for example, that another tree has, right? So we say, I'm going to have to use this phrase with you. I'm trying to not use it, but I'm going to have to use it. So the idea is that we can ask about the being that is the condition for the possibility of the being that is the tree. The first kind of being has the hyphen. The second kind of being does not have the hyphen. So the tree is, we can say that the tree is a being, no hyphen there. And then we can ask about the being of this being. When we ask about the being of this being, then the being that we're asking about gets a hyphen. It's the being with a hyphen. Okay. When we do empiricism, relates to something in an empirical manner, what we're talking about is the experience of the being without the hyphen, right? So we're talking about the experience of the tree. What does its bark feel like? What colors does it exhibit? Does my cat like to scratch it? These kinds of things, right? So when we're talking about the experience of a being, we're talking about empiricism. When we're talking about the being of that being, we're talking about ontology. Very quickly, just notice that there's actually three things I'm emphasizing here, right? So the one in the middle is the being without a hyphen, and that's the tree. The experience is empiricism. There's the being that is the tree without the hyphen. There's the experience of the being without the hyphen that is the tree, for example. And then there is the being that is the condition for the possibility of the being that is the tree, and that being has the hyphen. Right? So it's important to recognize the difference between ontology and empiricism. So here we go I want to go just a little bit further into this because it is helpful to understand how objectivity and subjectivity fit in with this conversation. So we can talk about something that really this has been around forever, and I'm not, no pun intended there. Credit goes to Martin Heidegger for really reintroducing this, I would say, against the likes of people like Bertrand Russell and so on and so forth. But so anyway, whereas the study of beings, I'm reading this to you here, notice without a hyphen, it's helpful to just read along with me so you can recognize when there's a hyphen and when there isn't. So whereas the study of beings is ontical, the study of being is ontological. This language primarily comes from Heidegger's Being and Time. Many philosophy professors that I know say that they think that this language, is ugly. I don't necessarily disagree with them. If we can avoid this language, then that's fine. I just wanted to make note of it. It's very important to recognize what comes next here, and that is the empirical study of a being is ontical, and the transcendental study of a being is ontological. So that's a very important distinction for us. Even if you don't ever want to use the word ontical or ontic, that's fine. You can stick with empirical and empiricism, but it is important to help us recognize this distinction between empirical and ontological. All right. So the next here we have objectivity and subjectivity reveal the presence of beings quantitatively, right? So notice that when I have an experience, empiricism, when I have an experience of a being, that's whenever we start talking about objectivity and subjectivity. But when we are talking about the being of that being, notice we are not talking about objectivity and subjectivity. If you understand that, you just saved yourself so much time. Okay, lastly here, the transcendental method and transcendental, or otherwise known as transcendental phenomenology, allows an envisioning awareness. I love that phrase. I think it accurately describes a kind of thought, a kind of mental or psychic actualization that happens. Transcendental phenomenology, or the transcendental, notice the word method from our last episode on criteriology. The transcendental phenomenology allows an envisioning awareness of being, and that's being with a hyphen, as the condition for the possibility of beings. So when we're doing ontology, what we're trying to do is apply a method that is not the empirical method, right? It is a different method. It's ultimately the transcendental method. And we're applying the transcendental method so that what is revealed by this relation to beings is the very being of that being. So lastly, notice how if we take everything that we've just said, when we were talking about the tree, there was a deep sense in which we were doing philosophical cosmology, right? But notice what happens if we do this in terms of philosophical psychology. So the exact same criteria, the exact same method and way of moving in thought in relation to the tree, to the being that is the tree, if we were to move that way in relation to the being that is you, or the being that is me. On the one hand, there is the being that is experienced. You see me, you see the different aspects of me, you can hear me, and this is then objective and also subjective, right? But whenever we ask the question of what is the kind of being that is the condition for the possibility of that being that you are experiencing, I feel as though it is the one and only method, sincerely, that it is the one and only method for revealing or coming to understand spirit. It is the one and only method for revealing the meaning of spirit. How can I understand spirit? And once I come to understand spirit, there is a deep sense then in which, just like there's those two kinds of beings, there's the being without the hyphen that we have empirical access to, and then the being with the hyphen that we have transcendental access to. And so then there is some sense in which I have to ask the question, so in what sense then am I more than the empirical being that you're experiencing? I think, the ability to ask that question is the heart of philosophy. So we'll talk more about this in the first seminar, but I think that when we come back to these basic concepts, anytime that we get confused or we just say, hey, I just want a quick brush up on what is ontology, then that's what we have this episode for. Thank you so much.